will go ahead and get started while we're waiting for everyone to come in the room, just because I have a couple housekeeping things. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back, or welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's live virtual event with author Ann Hagedorn. She's the author of Sleeper Agent, The Atomic Spy in America Who Got Away. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that our virtual author series continues Wednesday evening with Jeff Vandermeer, author of the thriller Hummingbird Salamander, and Thursday evening with Sean Evans, author of Maiden Voyages, Magnificent Ocean Liners, and the Women Who Traveled and Worked Aboard Them. And that one will be at 6 p.m. on Thursday. We do have a full lineup of authors this fall. September highlights include the talk co-host Amanda Klutz, who will discuss her book, Live Your Life, My Story of Loving and Losing Nick Cordero. And Pulitzer Prize winning author Isabel Wilkerson will discuss her book, Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents on September 15th. You can register and view a list of all of our upcoming programs at hudsonlibrary.org. Ann's book is available for purchase, courtesy of the Hudson's independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. We will put a link in the chat for purchase information. And as always, questions for the author are welcome and encouraged at any time during the discussion. Just type your question into the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. It's my privilege to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Ann Hagedorn has been a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and has taught writing at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism and at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Her previous books are Wild Ride, Ransom, Beyond the River, and Savage Peace. Ann, welcome.
It's great to be here. Really wonderful. So I will start out, I will introduce the book to the audience and a few details, author details that I really like, that I'd like to share. And then I'll do a few readings from the book that I would also like to share. So first, Sleeper Agent is my sixth narrative nonfiction book. And before I go into great detail about it, I do want to make a few comments about narrative nonfiction. It's my job as a narrative nonfiction writer to engage readers, general readers, about meaningful issues through the art of storytelling. And so my quest is always to find the compelling narrative that will bring alive for the general reader all issues and individuals at the core of the book's topic. The criteria for choosing topics include significance, of course, a topic in danger of falling through the cracks of history. That's always at the top of my list. A topic with literary potential. It must be doable research-wise. It must have general reader appeal, of course, and it must rouse my writerly passions. So first, I choose the topic, then I find the best narrative to bring it alive. That's the usual sequence. But this time, I discovered a remarkable story first. It grabbed me from the start. And it all started with a gentleman, actually from New York, who was telling me all about another book topic. I was interviewing him in 2016 for an idea that I had. And toward the end of the interview, knowing that I had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, he asked if I knew about the secret site in Dayton tied to the highly secretive Manhattan Project. A while ago, he said someone had told him that a Soviet spy worked there during World War II and lived in the same community where I had spent much of my childhood. So for a week or so after the interview, I continued my pursuit of the details for the other story, for the other book idea and narrative. But then a mix of skepticism and curiosity drove me to drop what I was doing and see what I could find out. I had no name, and quite frankly, I really did believe it was a rumor. No disrespect to the gentleman I had interviewed, but these rumors float around and come to writers and interviewers all the time. So like I said, I had this driving force of curiosity and skepticism. And I made a few calls, checked some details on the internet. And I found the spy's name, George Koval, in the New York Times story published about a decade before that, in the aftermath of Vladimir Putin giving a posthumous award to the spy. Then I made 3 lists, what seemed to be known, what was clearly unknown and would have to be known in order to flesh out a good story or a biography, and where there might be helpful archives and much needed primary sources. Next came what I call the flight plan, a schedule for the research. This meant such things as calling the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and gaining some updated wisdom about how to best use the Freedom of Information Act to acquire the FBI reports. Then visiting the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, plus some invaluable interviews in the DC area. And the DC trip was the turning point. So from then on, as everyone in my life, and there are some people in the audience right now who know this very well, I barely took a day off from the process of finding letters, journals, postcards, news clips, yearbooks, photos, maps, tax records, ship manifests, passports, arrest records, application forms, registrations, even inscriptions in books, and thousands upon thousands of pages of FBI reports. And then there was also the regimen, the daily regimen of reading applicable secondary sources in the numerous domains of the narrative, from the 20th century anti-Semitism in Russia and America to the Soviet espionage tactics and networks in the 1930s and 1940s in America, to the manufacture of the element polonium, the fuel for the trigger of the atomic bomb, and the timelines of the making of the atomic bomb in the United States and also in the Soviet Union, all in the pursuit of putting together the pieces of the life of a Soviet military intelligence officer who, as a U.S. Army corporal, had full security clearance in America's top secret World War II project to build the first atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project. So the who and the when were doable on the challenges list. I was confident about that. For it to be a true biography, the why, the what, and the how had to be fleshed out. So that was not so easy. It's never easy when you're researching the life of a spy, but especially one who was never caught, because there are no trial transcripts to refer to. Still, it was doable, and Sleeper Agent is indeed the biography of a spy. He was born and raised in Iowa and known for charming everyone he met. He happened to love baseball. He was a skilled shortstop. He could reel off the history and stats of every big league pitcher. He played bridge. He was a fan of Walt Whitman and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He belonged to a bowling league and was, by several accounts, quite the ladies' man. He obviously blended well into the American culture, and some of the time he was sending atomic secrets to Moscow to help speed up the creation of their own atomic bomb. Among the most fascinating details is, of course, what the subtitle reveals to you, the fact that he was never caught. Like all spy stories, the book gives readers the expected intrigue of some espionage details. There are code names, various cover shops in Manhattan, apartments in the Bronx. There are the suspicious routines of Koval's handler. I had quite an adventure finding the addresses of the cover shops and then visiting the premises, even interviewing current owners about the history of their buildings and measuring distances from the main cover shop on West 23rd Street in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan to the Flatiron building where meetings had taken place with Koval's handler. That took 5 minutes, by the way. But the book goes beyond that. It is a biography that delves into the psychology of the spy, showing the hopes, fears, and beliefs that spurred his decisions and accomplishments. Everyone's life must have meaning, and I wanted to unveil the people and events that shaped the meaning in Koval's. To immerse the reader into the historical context in which the spy functioned, to basically deepen the themes and significance of a typical spy story and connect the reader to what I call the human constants. I wanted to speak to the human condition, like in the first paragraph of the book, the beginning of the prologue, which reads, sometimes the clues that should have been warnings are lost in a blur, only to be seen in hindsight. Caught in the need to move ahead, most people rush like speeding trains past the truths and half-truths, tucked into the terrain they thought they knew. And so it would be for a man and a woman one evening in 1948 at New York City's Grand Central Palace, each soon to learn the timeless cost of missing clues. Unquote. By the way, I always write the first paragraphs of my book, sometimes entire prologues and first chapters in the New York Public Library reading room. It's a tradition, my respect to public libraries. After speaking of the theme of connecting the reader to the human constants, after reading an early copy of Sleeper Agent, a good friend of mine, Nick Clooney, told me that Koval's biography connected him to the intensity of the Cold War battle of the American dream versus the communist workers' paradise. Nick said that Koval's life personified that struggle. And a Russian scholar knowledgeable about Koval wrote to me a few weeks ago saying, quote, George Koval's life journey through the 20th century's American and Russian destinies and his work as an intelligence agent had such an impact on world history that his personality and fate will long be the subject of study in both Russia and the United States, unquote. The book also exposes the backlash of bigotry, the persistence of prejudice throughout history, basically the human costs of oppression. Though his self-designed tapestry of lies and half-truths depicts a true traitor, Koval was also a dedicated scientist, and he was a resilient survivor of anti-Semitism in both Russia and America. He was someone who knew the human cost of oppression. And one of the book's reviewers drew attention to that, commenting on the subtext that runs through Koval's story, being the ugly, quote, the ugly anti-Semitism, first in Russia, which his parents fled, escaping murderous pogroms, and then the Russian Revolution, setting off a wave of anti-Semitism in America, claiming Jews were Bolsheviks and thus America's enemies, unquote. I'd like to add here a comment made by Tom Lawrenson, the husband of one of my Denison University friends of many years. Quote, like a good novel, I'm led to an understanding of the lead character. George wasn't a killer or doing any great evil. Many Americans would do for their country of birth what he did for his country of culture and political leaning, unquote. And I thought that was very insightful and interesting. Koval's story also shows the expertise and determination of Russian military intelligence and how we've often underestimated Russian capabilities in technology and science in general. As former Defense Secretary and CIA Chief James Schlesinger said at the time of the discovery of bugs in the structure of the US Embassy in Moscow, I believe it was in 1985, he testified regarding the case, and part of what he said, quote, "The culprit is American complacency, the tendency to assume that the Russians are technically inferior to us and that we can always handle them," unquote. By the way, he called the US Embassy in Moscow the best bugged building ever built. That's a quote. An important point to make here is that this is also a spy story that transcends the debates about the scale of Soviet espionage in wartime America, and hopefully turns the reader's attention to the fact that scapegoating, opportunism, and bigotry blurred the vision of what was truly happening regarding the Soviet spy networks. Hoover knew there were such networks, and he was right, but he was often hunting in the wrong territory. For example, he thought all members of the Communist Party USA had to be spies, but look at George Koval. He played bridge, belonged to a bowling league, not the Communist Party USA, and he mingled with his scientific peers in an electrical engineering honorary fraternity, not with his quote unquote fellow travelers, as his espionage peers were called. He simply blended in. The book answers long and lingering questions about Koval's double life. It brings to light many new details. It reveals why he was undetected, and it shows there were no coincidences. As a source of mine from years ago, when I was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, a former federal prosecutor actually told me when I asked him about the best ways to investigate, he said, use timelines and chronologies and never accept coincidences. I did both for this book. One good example of that was Koval's enrollment at Columbia University shortly after he returned to America as a Red Army trained spy. That fact was simply a line in one of the FBI files, a line without any context. He got a B, by the way, on the course, in the course. Anyhow, it's a great example of what could appear to be a detail of very little significance, but with some study, mainly timelines about what was happening then in nuclear physics, it becomes far, far more important than somebody taking a chemistry course at an Ivy League school because he loved science, which he did, or he wanted to make friends at his new home in New York City. To be sure, by the time of Koval's enrollment in 1941, Columbia had become a magnet for some of the most highly regarded physicists and chemists in the world, some destined to play stellar roles in the upcoming production of the first atomic bomb. And there had been a very detailed front page article in the New York Times on May 5th, 1940, about what was happening at Columbia in physics. An article that Koval's handler would definitely have seen. So there was no coincidence here. So you take a fact, dig further, establish some timelines, and then the truth begins to surface. One of my favorite details was Koval's job at Oak Ridge as a health physicist. It was known that he was assigned to Oak Ridge. That was a line on all of his forms and applications, his passport applications. But exactly what did he do there? What was his daily routine, and how would that have affected his access to top secret information? Well, he was a health physicist. And one of my greatest adventures in the research of this book was at Oak Ridge, at the Oak Ridge Public Library, which has the Oak Ridge Room, which is filled with archives. And I learned all about the health physics department which was created at Oak Ridge to measure levels of radiation contamination. And such work required routine, quote, access to confidential and secret information, unquote. In fact, most, if not all, information pertaining to health physics during Koval's tenure at Oak Ridge was classified. Health physicists had to learn the basic chemical properties of all the radioactive materials they were monitoring. They were asked to be present whenever repair work was done on any equipment at any of the plants. And no shipment could leave the Oak Ridge site without the approval of members of the health physics department. Also, the health physicists conducted routine surveys of all offices and labs as they checked for signs of contamination. 3 important steps for the health physics workers were always noted in their training materials. Know all operations in your area. Be alert to all changes. Make thorough surveys regularly. So that was the job of the Red Army trained spy, who, by the way, had a US Army Jeep, because those facilities at Oak Ridge are many miles apart from each other, and he had to visit various sites on a regular basis. Finding such details is what I call the aha moment in research, and there were numerous examples of aha moments in the process of piecing together Koval's life. At the National Archives, I actually shouted aha, I think, as I recall, while I was reading a very helpful 250-page plus file discovered by one of the archivists. And I must have been humming ahas when I was walking the streets of Manhattan and the Bronx to map out where Koval and his fellow travelers had worked and lived. But I see I've been telling you about this for about 20 minutes. So before I do a few readings, I will close with my hopes for the book. Of course, I hope that Sleeper Agent will deepen the reader's understanding of the intriguing psychology of a spy. We should all understand what motivates a person to enter the double life and of the timeless costs of oppression. And I hope that it will be helpful to future researchers and contribute to the step-by-step process of prying open the closed chapters in the story of Soviet espionage in America. So that's my presentation. And let's see, how many minutes do I have to do a few readings? So Polly, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, you can do as much as you want. I mean, we want to leave some time for audience questions, but this will give them some time to start typing in those questions. I'm sure people have some good ones. So you go ahead and read.
Okay, so also you saw Polly's version of the book. This is the author's, lots of Post-its. I actually wanted to dedicate one of my books to the inventor of Post-its, but many people said, you really shouldn't do that. Okay, so someday maybe I will. Okay, so I read you the first paragraph, correct, of the prologue. So the prologue does introduce you to Koval and during his last weeks in America in 1948. And to his girlfriend, his 1948 girlfriend, and who, by the way, believed he was born in Cleveland and grew up in an orphanage in Cleveland. And she did not know he had a wife back in the Soviet Union and parents and siblings. But at any rate, the end of the prologue is about his exit from America, and these are the closing 2 paragraphs. Though documents and interviews would someday expose parts of the truth about Koval's escape from America, some questions would never be answered, like what he was thinking as he watched the New York skyline diminish and the ocean's vast expanse draw near. Was he remembering the last time he had left America in May 1932 with his parents and his two brothers on a ship leaving from Pier 54, bound eventually for the Soviet Union? Or the details of his father's stories about being a Russian immigrant and seeing America for the first time in 1910? Did he have the manner of a professional, lacking last-minute hesitations or sentimentality as the ship passed by the great statue symbolizing the freedoms of the country that was his birthplace? And did he struggle to push back all thoughts of what and whom he was leaving behind? By November, Koval would be living in the Soviet Union in Moscow with his wife of 12 years. And he would soon reunite with his 65-year-old father and his 58-year-old mother, plus one of his two brothers. What he told them about his past 8 years in America on a quote unquote business trip for the Soviet military intelligence is unknown. But one certain fact is that George Koval left the US just in time. And as anyone who knew him would likely say, his timing was always nearly perfect. So I think next I shall read you the beginning of chapter 5, which is called Undercover in the Bronx. And it is after the prologue, you go into his background and his parents' background and growing up in Iowa. And that is called The Lure. And part 2 is called The Deception. And it begins with his return after being trained as a Soviet military intelligence officer. I'm particularly fond of this. I had an editor at the Wall Street Journal, wonderful person who always told all of us, never fall in love with your own writing. And I know there's some writers there in the audience, and they've probably been told that. And I don't ever fall in love with my own writing. I'm very critical of it. But there are parts that I do like, partly because they were such a huge challenge to create from the research end of it. And this was especially difficult. My wondrous Russian translator did endless digging to find out how George returned to America in 1940. And I went through endless ship manifests, et cetera, Joanne Drilling, who worked for me as a research assistant, who did a marvelous job of indexing the thousands of pages of FBI files, sent her on the ship manifest adventure. Nothing turned up, and Masha, the Russian translator, found this, which is a combination of, partly it's from a lecture George gave later in life, partly from a series of letters that Masha discovered, and it's marvelous, I think. So it's the beginning of chapter 5, Undercover in the Bronx. One September night in 1940, somewhere in the East China Sea, mountainous waves were tossing a small cargo ship on which George Koval was en route from Vladivostok, a port in the far southeast corner of the Soviet Union, to San Francisco. Quote, "We almost got into the center of a cyclone," unquote, he wrote in a letter to his wife. Quote, "The rocking was huge and all books and furniture were falling on us as we fell off our beds," unquote. Crossing 4,554 nautical miles, the trip would take more than 3 weeks, adding to Koval's 6-day, 5,772-mile train journey from Moscow to Vladivostok. During the calm days when the winds were a total delight, Koval wrote that he played chess or dominoes with the ship's captain and read stories to the captain's 9-year-old daughter, who called him Uncle Grisha. Bonding with the captain's family on such a long passage would prove essential when the ship docked in America. Though he carried a fake passport, Koval planned to help unload the cargo and then slip away, possibly to a meeting place in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he would be given whatever was needed for his continuing travels. Because it was a cargo ship, at that time, the Customs Patrol didn't process entry papers for crew members returning in a quick turnaround to Vladivostok. Still, U.S. officials conducted a seemingly thorough inspection of the ship, during which Koval hid in a storage bench in the captain's quarters. Sitting on top were the captain, his wife, and his daughter. The English-speaking inspectors asked to see identification documents for the captain and his family, a process that apparently took longer than the little girl could tolerate. And so she looked up at her mother and asked in Russian, "Will Uncle Grisha have to stay under the couch much longer?" Unquote. The mother smiled, said nothing, and continued to hold her daughter's hand while her husband focused on the officials. The calm response of the mother and father, plus the fact that the inspectors likely knew little, if any, Russian, or were simply paying no attention to a little girl's exchange with her mother, saved the day for the Soviet spy. Soon Koval was boarding a train to New York City. So let's see. So how much time, Polly, do we have now? Another little detail that you might like, which also shows the great mix of research, the research that must be done on a spy who isn't caught because there are no trial transcripts. My editor said that there had to be a physical description and a sort of personality description of Koval's handler, but there wasn't anything anywhere like that, of course. It took months to find out who his handler was, much less to figure out what he had looked like. And so you'll be interested to know that after deep research, I learned that he was a graduate of Ohio Northern University in 1912. So my local librarian got the yearbook for me so I could see what he looked like when he graduated from college. And then I read through pages, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of interviews with people about what his personality was like, interviews in the FBI files. And so this is my one paragraph that took probably 2 months of research. So, no complaints. But at any rate, it's great. My editor was very happy. He said the reader will know what he looked like. Yeah. With his rimless glasses and expressionless face, this was a man of medium height, about 5'7", who seemed quite ordinary. His thin brown hair showed specks of gray at an early age, and by the time Koval met him, the graying around the temples was a solid feature, as was the diamond stick pin he always wore on his tie or lapel. What made him blend into a gathering of strangers and yet stand out among acquaintances was the fact that he rarely smiled. By most accounts, he exuded an aura of skepticism and caution. A former colleague would describe him as, quote, very private and very discreet, a man with whom few wanted to spend time, due to some unknown fear of him, unquote. Maybe it was just his silence. He looked hard at people, said so little. So that's Koval's handler. So let's see. So Polly, where are we? Why don't I do one more?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
We have some questions coming in. So yeah, do one
good.
more. That's great.
That's good. So I'll do one more and yeah, okay. And this will be his landlady in the Bronx. Actually, I think we'll go forward to, if we have any time, I'll do that one. But for now, I think I'll do the part of the book that matches that quote from James Schlesinger. And that also gives you a peek at Koval's life in the Soviet Union in his elderly years. Excuse me. Chapter 17, entitled Exposed. The grand opening of the newly constructed U.S. Embassy in Moscow in May 2000 was one of those events that seemed to exalt and shame simultaneously. Pride must have glazed the walls as the speeches rolled out and the glasses clinked, for there was no doubt that the postmodern building of stone and glass was quite an architectural and political accomplishment. At the same time, the occasion was a disturbing reminder that the entire project had taken more than 30 years to complete, a time during which high-profile gaffes had earned America's Moscow embassy such headline images as, quote, bungled and bugged, unquote. After a 1969 agreement to proceed with a new embassy, the construction finally began in the fall of 1979. With directives calling for the Soviet Union to use its own labor and materials to build the basic structure. The host country was also given the right to review architectural drawings for the building's frame to ensure that it met local, meaning Soviet, building codes and standards. But 6 years later, the Soviet workers were ejected from the site, and work was suspended after Soviet listening devices implanted in concrete pillars were found in the structural shell of the building. Then it would take many more years for the US and the USSR to agree to a solution for dealing with such permanent eavesdropping systems, while Americans debated the prickly issue of slipshod scrutiny. As former Defense Secretary and CIA Chief James Schlesinger said at the time of the discovery, that's the quote that I gave you earlier about the best bugged building ever built. Through the years, there had been attempts to plant devices at the old embassy, in which it opened in 1953, such as the Soviets' gift of a large replica of the Great Seal of the United States, replete with a tiny listening mechanism found only after it had been hanging on the wall of the U.S. ambassador's study for nearly 2 decades. Then in the 1960s, 40 microphones had been found in the embassy walls. And in the 1980s, bugs were discovered in at least a dozen electric typewriters, one of them used by the secretary of the second-ranking embassy diplomat. These were sensors capable of picking up the contents of typed documents. There were also the honey trap cases, including a scandal around the same time as the shocking find at the new embassy construction site. This one involved a Marine security guard arrested and soon convicted of espionage after his affair with a Soviet woman working at the US embassy. The woman had a KGB handler. Perhaps there would always be walls with ears at the embassy, though what was learned by such astute listening was not always picked up by the press. In 1999, for example, a somewhat significant spy story moved across the embassy landscape, missed by the media searchlight. In early June, a thin, stooped, bespectacled 85-year-old George Koval entered the American embassy without notice, 40 years after US officials had invited him there, hoping to interrogate him. Okay, so I think that's all for now.
That was a really good spot to leave it too, because it
Yeah.
was such a good teaser for that ending.
Yeah, right.
I won't give it away, but there is
Yeah.
some really, when I was reading, I was like, oh my gosh, really?
I know. Yeah, I know. It
So
is
you got to get the book,
intriguing.
everyone, and read that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have some questions coming in, and I'm thinking because, obviously we're in Ohio. A lot of people want to know, could you expound on the secret site in Dayton, Ohio,
Oh,
and
yeah.
what work was done there regarding the Manhattan Project?
Oh, yes. Well, that's, I think that's chapter 9 in the book. Read the book. Right. It's, that was one of my favorite parts of the research, of course. And partly because the polonium was not revealed in many of the reports that came out after the bombs were released in 1945. Nothing about the polonium was released for years. In fact, the earliest research tool I could find was a 400-page account about polonium and the Dayton Project in a 1956 report at the Atomic Energy Commission. So polonium, it was purified and produced in Dayton, and polonium was the essential fuel for the trigger of the bomb, and for both bombs. And so the story of how there were two different ways to produce it. One was through natural ways, and that was done at first in Dayton, and then at Oak Ridge in their facility called the X10 plant. They experimented with ways to synthesize polonium by irradiating bismuth. And so eventually that process was began in Dayton, and it was done. There were 4 different units in Dayton. They were run by Monsanto Chemical Company, and it's just an utterly fascinating story. Unit 4, where the polonium was purified, and where George Koval spent a great deal of his time after he was transferred there in June. You can well imagine, once you read about polonium, you realize what a dangerous element it is. And so the health physicists were really hugely needed in Dayton. And so they expanded the numbers in June when the irradiated bismuth started coming in huge amounts from Oak Ridge and was purified and then sent on to Los Alamos. But this was done. Unit 4 in Dayton was in the suburb of Oakwood, and it was only about a mile from where I had grown up, and where many friends I have to this day lived nearby. It was the facility was a playhouse, a huge, beautiful playhouse that was transformed into a polonium purification plant, basically. So there's a lot about it in the book. I think you'll find it interesting. I find the fact that it took so many years for people to learn about it, a story within the story, and conversation for another time. But it's an utterly fascinating part of the history of the Manhattan Project. And it's a great tribute to Dayton, and I give a huge tribute to Dayton at the beginning of chapter 9, because of I was so surprised by the huge numbers of war projects, World War II projects that were based in Dayton. So I think you'll like that part.
I did. I was going to ask about that playhouse. That was a really fascinating part of the story.
Yeah.
I had to go Google that when I was just to see, I'm just intrigued at what that looked like at this
Yeah,
time.
that's right. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll let those details be part of the book,
Yeah,
'cause that was really fascinating.
many details. And
Yeah.
there's some good secondary sources that have come out in recent years as details have been declassified about it. So, and those are all, I spent a great deal of time on the bibliography and the source notes essay, because there was just a great deal. well, anyhow, a great deal of research that obviously had to go into it, but also that I wanted to share with people, and also sort of compliment people who had gone before me on that. Although I dare say I may be the first author who read the 435 pages on what polonium is and the Dayton Project in the 1956 report.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Well,
Okay, so Mary would like to know, what was the motivation for him to turn into a spy for Russia, especially considering that his parents had been persecuted in Russia? And then how long did he live in Russia before returning to the US?
how long did he live in Russia before returning? I guess 8 years. He lived in Russia before returning to the US, and then he lived in the US for 8 years before returning to the Soviet Union. Yeah. So yes, well, I wish I could interview George Koval, and of course that would be the first question: why did you do this? And I think because he did have an exchange, I was able to interview a 98-year-old gentleman who was a colleague of George's at Oak Ridge. He's alive. We exchange emails now on a regular basis, and Dwayne double dated with George at Oak Ridge, and I learned a great deal about George's personality and what could have been his motivations through interviewing Dwayne, and also reading the exchanges between another colleague of theirs at Oak Ridge, some emails and letters exchanged between George and that individual, who did get to ask him, did you regret what you did? I mean, we don't know what he knew about Stalin at that point. Was he doing it because of the fact that the idealism his family instilled in him in his childhood? Did he believed in that communism was the way to end world oppression? Did he do it because of his dedication to communism, to his dedication to science? Or to his dedication to his family? And I think the more research I did, the more I realized he did it to protect his family during the war. And I really believe that, because I don't think he had much choice. He was ideal. If you study what agents like that kind of training they have to go through to be placed as illegals in target countries, it can take years to lose the Russian accent in the English language. Well, they didn't have to do that with George. He was a scientist. He spoke perfect English. In fact, he had a hard time learning Russian. And, and he was brilliant. And so, and plus, as you'll read in the book, Masha found all these details about how he and his wife's family was in some trouble at that point, because she came from an Russian aristocracy. And so that wasn't so great during the Stalin years. And so they had some big challenges. I'm sure he knew that if he became a GRU, I doubt whether he had a choice, but when he did make the choice, in all the documents that we could find, it showed that he did make the choice to go ahead with the training and become a Red Army trained intelligence agent, but I'm not so sure at all that he did have the choice. I mean, I think there were all of these issues, and especially of the protection of his family in wartime. So, and if he was a member of the GRU, they were going to have benefits during the war. And if he died during the war, they would be better taken care of than if it didn't do it. So I believe he was motivated to do it out of loyalty to his family, and also the demands of being in the Red Army after September 1st, 1939. Yeah. And so, which is when things changed in terms of the obligations of man his age in Russia, in the Soviet Union. So yeah, that's the best I can tell you without interviewing him. Yeah. Uh-oh, let's see.
Someone, oh, I'm good. I'm here. I forgot I muted myself. When and why did his parents return to Russia from Iowa?
Oh, good question. Yeah. Whew, yeah. Well, that has a lot to do with the anti-Semitism in the 1920s, which was, I did a lot of research at the Center for Jewish History on West 16th Street in New York City, wonderful place, and learned a lot about anti-Semitism in America and the rise of the Klan, the Russian Jews being viewed as America's enemies, and the equivalent of Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution. You know, they George's father was a very high up official in something called I-Corps, which was an organization for the colonization of Jews in the Soviet Union in something called the Jewish Autonomous Region. So that, and so they returned in 1932 to be settlers in the Soviet Far East in what was called the Jewish Autonomous Region. So they were very active in promoting this new region and promoting settlers to travel there from all over the world, Jewish settlers, yeah.
When did Dwayne find out that George was a spy?
Great question. Yeah. Yeah, Dwayne found out George was a spy through his communication with the other colleague at Oak Ridge. So the exact year, but that's great. Thank you for asking that. I'm going to ask Dwayne. I don't think I've ever asked him that. Right. But that's how, because I think the three of them were exchanging, were communicating in the early part of the new century. I know he knew before that New York Times article that was the decade before I knew. And so the article that reported on Vladimir Putin giving the high award posthumously to George. So yeah, so it was earlier than that, but he didn't know at all when they were at Oak Ridge. Though it's very interesting to talk to Dwayne, because he did always wonder, why did George get the Jeep? Yeah, so yeah. Yeah, I hope that answers the question, but the exact date when he found out, that's really a great question. Yeah.
Okay, and I think we've got one more question. It's just about end of the time. So, and then how did he get into the US military after returning from Russia? Wasn't that suspicious, or didn't they know about his Russian travels?
Oh, they knew nothing about his Russian travels. No, because when he came back to the United States, as I read to you, he came back through San Francisco. He had a false passport. And when he returned, that would have been in October, late October 1940. In January of 1941, he registered with the U.S. Army, and under his name, George Koval. So it just looked like George Koval had never left. And his name was not on the passport, on the family passport, when the family left in 1932. So yeah, and so then you really have to read the book and see the progression of his moving closer and closer to the Manhattan Project, because it's really about three different timelines that come together to sort of show how he ended up there. So it would take me about 15 minutes, I think, to summarize it. So you have to read the book. Yeah, I'm gonna have to get a baseball cap that says "read the book." Yeah, but thank you for the question. Yeah, good one. And you know, the main answer to it is that it was a combination of his testing exceptionally well, getting into something called the U.S. Army trained specialized training program, then testing very high again and getting into the special engineer detachment. These were scientists who were sent to the Manhattan Project. And then once he got there, being placed into the health physics, because he had so much scientific background and he tested so high. So, and there was, I think the ultimate answer to that question is really, why would they have checked his past? You know, why, when intelligence was focusing on Nazi spies, the Soviet Union was our ally, and we needed scientists. And so why would they have gone bit by bit, sent someone to Sioux City to check out whether he had lived there in 1936, as he put on his application? Things like that. I mean, you know, it just wouldn't have happened. Today, of course, it would have. It would have been a matter of computer research. So he couldn't have done it today, but it worked then.
And then we had one late question come in. Did George reunite with his Russian wife?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he did. Yeah. And they lived together until her death. And that scene of George going to the U.S. Embassy is just a couple months after her death, I think. I think she died in 1999. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Well, I just would like to thank you, Anne, for sharing your deep expertise on this subject. Everybody, please pick up this book. Once again, the copies are available through our local independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. You can click on that link in the chat. There's so much more detail and so much more to the story than we were even able, as Anne has already said, to uncover tonight. So please check that out. And thank everyone for being here tonight. Thank you, Anne, for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.